Okay, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I now call to order this work session of the Anchorage Assembly regarding zoning ideas and discussion to facilitate more housing. It's Friday, March 10, 2023. We're scheduled from 1 to 2:30 p.m. today. We're getting started a little bit late. It's about 1:17.
Just having a work session.
I'm just going to pause here so we can quiet down. Okay, there's one document for this work session. It's available at muni.org/worksessions. We'll go ahead and start with assembly member introductions for the record.
Austin Quinn Davidson. Thanks, Joey.
Joey Sweet.
Robin Dern.
Kevin Cross.
Daniel Voland.
Felix Rivera. Christopher Constant.
Suzanne LaFrance, and will be joined in a little while by Mr. Salt on the phone. I believe we have Craig Lyon on the phone. Are you there, Mr.
Yes,
Lyon?
I'm here.
Great, thank you.
I am here right now, and Mr. Whitfield is hopefully going to be joining us very soon.
Super. And we also have part of our legislative services team here as well.
Claire Ross, Legislative Services Director.
Shelley Roughton, Legislative and Policy Analyst.
Great, thanks for joining, everyone. And the intent of this work session is to get ideas from assembly members and have some dialogue with planning as well about potential zoning changes that could facilitate more housing. And before we get into that, I'm going to turn to Ms. Ross to talk a little bit about the document that was passed out, Anchorage Assembly Housing Initiative Priorities Project Tracker.
Thank you. Just for some history on how this all came about. In September, you had your annual assembly retreat, and we made housing the topic of that. And at that session, at the end of the day, after you had a great discussion with home builders, planning department members, and other community leaders on the topic, you came up with a priority list. That was each of you coming up with ideas that came from the day that you wanted to work on. So we then created a priority list. This document has not been adopted by the assembly, so it's not necessarily the assembly as a whole's priority, but you'll see each item on the list has a champion, so you can see which member is working on that. And so we took that priority list and then we grouped it into different categories. We have code changes, education, communication, planning processes, and municipal infrastructure, and MOA structural administrative changes. So we grouped them into categories, and then we put them in order. Some of you wonderfully just started working on these independently. So we put the ones that have been worked on in here. So the items in green are ones that have been complete, such as making changes to ADUs and ending parking minimums, clarifying and communicating the Assembly's role in housing. So you did pass a resolution in December that summarized a lot of these goals. And then the ones that we know about that are in progress are in yellow. So the third-party inspection for commercial developments, there's an open AO on that. There's stuff in the works for lot sizes, short-term rentals, etc. And other work that's been done on this, I met with Chief of Staff Adam Trombley probably in November, and we reviewed each item, and he gave me some notes on who to talk to, what the administration was working on. So those are in the notes field. And then Ms. Roughton then went to the Anchorage Home Builders Association and got their list of priorities. And so at I think some of them are intermingled if they had priorities that were similar to yours. And then at the end, there's a list of things that they had that you hadn't come up with yet. So with that, I'm hoping I can hand it over to Ms. Roughton to give you updates on some of the details of maybe the in progress ones.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ross. Thank you, Ms. Ross. maybe as I go through these, if the Assembly Champion wants to jump in and give a little update of anything that I missed, that would be great. So under code changes, create third-party inspection program for commercial developments. That is Mr. Cross, and that has been postponed to April.
That's correct. May I?
Yes, you may.
The chair. Yes. So we had a meeting with the Structural Engineers Association of Alaska, SEAC, I believe is what they go by. And we had a really robust conversation. There's 5 provisions to that that we're working on. One is to mandate that the MOA audit at least 10% of plans submitted through independent review. That way there's a policing. A way to flag individuals or third-party plan reviewers who show gross negligence, which is that they lose or they're exempted from being able to be utilized. That the insurance is tied to a value, the market value of the property, as opposed to just saying 1 million, that may be inadequate. That the building official, at the direction of either owner, purchaser, or owner's representative, shall be permitted to submit the plans to ask for a MOA review of an independent process, and finally omit or exempt significant structures as defined by AAC 39 point. So a significant structure is a property that houses more than 500 people, or is a hospital or a school or a power plant. And so those properties would be exempt from independent third-party review. So there's quite a rewrite that's going in, which is why I asked it to go into April. We're working on that AO. Once that's completed, it'll go back before the Building Department, Development Services, and back to the Structural Engineers Association of Alaska for any other tweaks. But what it started off as, we're still moving in that direction, but just making sure the concerns of the policymakers are taken into consideration. So thank you.
I'm going to jump in and go big picture a little bit before Shelley goes on to make sure that you get the most out of this work session. I think it was called specifically I think there's been a lot of emails back and forth, and we wanted assembly members all in the room with the planning department so you could go back and forth on some details and ask questions. And I also think lot sizes was a priority project to talk about when we have everyone together. So I guess I think it might be worthwhile to do what we're doing and go through each of these in detail, but I want to check and see what you all think about process.
Yeah, I would like to start with the ones that you suggested, the bigger issues that you need the feedback from members on as far as next steps. So yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Great, thank you. And yeah, you're right. This is supposed to be about zoning. So abolish minimum lot sizes. We've talked about this a lot in CEDC. And one of the problems that we've discovered is that in the narrative, where it talks about dwelling units per acre, you'll have one number. And then in the charts, I think this is 21.04, you will have a different number, and those don't match. And so one of the things we're looking at is, do you want to just make those match? Do you want to abolish lot size minimums? Do you want to reduce lot size minimums? And so we are doing the analysis in GIS. The other issue is if you abolish lot size minimums or reduce them, but you still have issues with setbacks and lot frontages, did you do any good? If you still can't build anything.
Thanks,
So-
Shelley. And so by we, you're talking about, I
Yeah,
assume, Mr.
you-
Boland and Mr.
yes,
Cross.
Yes.
You both are working
Yes.
on bringing something forward.
Well, it's something we both are very interested in and have discussed. And to Shelley's point, in Title 21, Chapter 4, it lays out purpose statements for each zoning district and says, this zoning district should be able to accomplish or to accommodate these many dwellings per acre. But then if you look at the table of what is actually permitted in Title 21, Chapter 6, I think it's R2 and up, we actually don't allow that same density that's called for in chapter 4. So I think, if we wanted to take perhaps just one step forward, a small step forward, we would get rid of that inconsistency in code, and we would align what is allowed more closely to the stated purpose of those zoning districts. I think if we wanted to take a bigger step forward, we could look at reducing further lot sizes, or potentially abolishing minimum lot sizes. Now, I would be interested to learn more about how that impacts utilities to properties, as well as what Shelley brought up with setbacks, et cetera. But I'm thinking of in my neighborhood, South Addition, there was a developer, Seth Anderson, who created this really cool little development of cottage homes. And at the time it was, kind of controversial. And I think there were members on this body now who were on the body then, and can kind of remember the debate over that. But, I was involved before I was on the assembly on the South Addition neighborhood plan committee. And we talked a lot about residences, construction that fits the context of the neighborhood and bulk and height and the historic character. And while I think, I agree and disagree with some of those tenants, I think Seth's development is a great example of infill density that, if you guys drive by 12th and Cordova, the way that he was able to subdivide that lot and create these little homes, it's pretty cool. And then I know that Andre Spinelli, he did a subdivision of smaller homes, and he actually, excuse me, he went through a variance process to be able to do that, to be able to divide up the lots smaller. And so I think there is a will on the part of housing builders to build smaller homes on smaller lots.
Yeah, so the large challenge I see in the lot size minimums is a lot of our lot size as far as green space has to do with water diversion. And so we'll have to work closely with planning to make sure that we don't have unexpected issues. Every time you put a roof up and every time you create a structure, you displace the water that would normally be absorbed by vegetation. And if it's not being absorbed by vegetation, then it's going to the stormwater system. And so if we're creating massive density, what does that look like? And so at some point we want smaller lots, but it has to be carefully balanced. And perhaps rather than a lot size, it is a percentage based, which is you can build a structure on a lot, but the structure can't be more than 60% of the lot size. And therefore you could build a 700 square foot property on a 4,000 square foot lot rather than stick with rigid minimums. It's a percentage to make sure that you have an aggregate for water absorption around the property. And of course, we'll have to work with stormwater on that because, that's the big, we're very wet town. It's not just snow removal, but it's drainage. And when you create structures and you go to smaller lots, where is that water going to be displaced to? And that's something as we go through this process, we're going to have to carefully examine and make sure that we prepare for. But I love the idea of smaller properties because the idea of everybody having, 6 kids and 8 cars and a motorhome and stuff is a diminishing American dream. And so I think we need to be realistic with the changing demographics. So thank you.
And I want to note that we were joined on the phone by Mr. Solt at 126. And then I also want to step back. I guess I'm looking at the spreadsheet and in how it's organized here, code changes and education communication, structural administrative changes, planning process, and other from AHBA, and just the items related to zoning, abolishing the minimum lot sizes, explore changing single-family zoning to new residential zoning with broader allowance for building types, lot coverage amendment. There's another one about do an area-wide rezone with the 2020 plan update and look into up zones. And just, I would ask you all, and especially those of you who've been taking up these issues in CEDC, as far as like a focus, is there a priority or is there like a roadblock in this that, we need to be like taking up as a body and working with planning? Or can you give me some, orientation in terms of like what you see as maybe prioritization as far as making progress with facilitating housing? And Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely. And, at least my take on it is that the focus has been primarily on trying to create housing within existing housing That's the priority. That's what the ADU amendment did. That's, and so, abolishing the parking minimums helps with the long-term planning. But realistically, we need to understand the most affordable way to add housing units effectively is by converting or repurposing existing construction. Starting over through new development and everything is a very long, lengthy process. So some of the items we're doing is we passed the ADU. The other thing that we're working on that's not on here, but is, there's a large, there's a reasonable number of non-conditional use properties. They are commercial properties that have since been zoned R1, but they're currently commercial. They're prohibited from putting ADUs on there the way that's currently written. So we're working at adjusting that to allow a commercial property to put an ADU, because you are technically not allowed to change the use. It triggers a residential, then you got to change the whole, like it's convoluted the way Chapter 13 of Title 21 is written. And so we're looking at how do we amend that to allow some ADUs on there. Additionally is, an ADU under 900 square feet, which we currently allow, you still under the current building code, got to tie that into the septic system. That can be a $60,000 to an $80,000 bill for a 700 square foot. So do we allow holding tanks on smaller ADUs? And is that permissible? Because at some point, the cost of tying in utilities is more than the cost of the structure. So we're still working on a lot of provisions on, okay, now that we allow ADUs, we still got to understand that they got to be built to residential code. Yet, if it's only a 500 or 700 square foot structure, is there some malleability in that that's reasonable? And first, we talked to departments, we talked to structural engineering, we talked to those individuals, make sure we're not just arbitrarily bypassing reasonable construction requirements. But so I will tell you, there's quite a bit that's being done on that. But it's a lot of in-depth information finding. The thing you look at is, why is that in place? And if we're going to solve it, are we not, are we still resolving the why while coming up with a less expensive alternative measure?
And is that CEDC that's working on that together, or is that like you and Daniel have?
Honestly, that's been kind of my own little thing. I've been taking up in the background, trying to get information. And then what I didn't want to do is drop something on it and go, I have no idea what to do here. So I'm accumulating the information, coming out with the bullet points, identifying the problems in the code, and then saying, okay, here's what it is. Let's have a work session with the building department to resolve this. But if I just say this is a frustration, they'll just go, yes, it is. Do you have an idea of how to solve it?
Well, so I think that would be one of the helpful things about this work session is to have maybe some prioritization, because I think what's happening right now is we have groups of 2 or 3 assembly members going to the planning department and saying, we want to do this, we want to do this. And so maybe that's a question for Craig too to weigh in on is, what are the projects that the planning department is working on, that if there's working groups that can be formed with the assembly and we can be part of those conversations, how do they want to tackle those things? For instance, this one right after abolish minimum lot sizes, the next one in the conversions of duplexes and triplexes. Well, I will say we have already formed a working group with the help of Shelley in the planning department. And some folks in the room are part of that working group. Amanda's here. And we brought in Andre Spinelli and Chris Schutte and a bunch of very talented people who are smarter than I am. And we're looking at treating triplexes and fourplexes as residential instead of commercial. And so that project is already underway. I think to your question though, Suzanne, maybe the planning department could give us feedback about how they want to approach these projects. And also just so folks know, this is that development. Jennifer put the picture up for me. Seth Anderson's South Addition project, where he subdivided the lot and made these really cute little historic looking homes, even though they're brand new. So more homes on a smaller lot, I think, can be a really good thing.
Thanks, Daniel. And we'll go to Chris, and then I'll ask if Mr. Lyon wants to weigh in. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks. Yeah, and interestingly, on this lot, there was a spring on the corner, and they managed the flow of water in a very creative way. And they had 5 lots on a 7,000 square foot lot, much to the chagrin of the neighbors. But in the end, it turned out to an incredible project that all are in use as single family private homes, not short-term rentals, and meets a lot of goals. So to the idea of should we prioritize or how we do this, I think what we would be wise to be doing is beginning the work to execute the housing summit and get ourselves to the point where we actually convene all of the folks in the community to establish what broadly are accepted as priorities that we could be working on. I know each of us will be working on our own small projects, and we should all continue to do that, because if you wait, then it might never come. But I think before we narrow our aperture toward a set of proposals as a whole, I think we should hear broadly from the community. So that's where I would stand. And I don't know what the timeline and thought is for the execution of that, but to me, that's a pretty important thought. And I thought we allowed ADUs in all zoning districts now. Didn't we change that completely, including commercial? And so if there is a further barrier, then we need to look at that code section, because that would be, just in my opinion, a simple conforming change that we need to get to if there's some other element that we didn't capture. So I want to make sure we put that on the table if it's not clear. And then finally, two parts to the last point. Like you had said, Kevin, I wrote down on my notes somewhere that we should put in, create a convening group on adaptive reuse processes, which is taking old buildings and turning them into something new. And my thought on that subject is we should actually create, or maybe even hire somebody whose job it is to coordinate an effort through the planning department or through the assembly branch that brings together a creative group of people whose mission it is in the ongoing way to be having discussions and researching and bringing back concepts for adaptive reuse. You heard Mr. Robbins in the last work session discuss this one property downtown, the McKinley building. They're doing that for us. They're creating a model for how an adaptive reuse could happen in one building, so other people can look at it and say, hey, we made 44 units out of a defunct commercial building that sat vacant for the last 7 years. And it's a great idea, and we need more thinking like that. So if we don't have a process to do that that's formalized, it's just going to keep being kind of as it comes. And so I think maybe we formalize that. And I don't know where that goes, but what it dawns on me is that we should have here like a whole section on innovation efforts. Like let's put a plank for innovation and make that kind of the place where we put novel concepts, maybe riskier projects, maybe projects that need some investment, so that we can begin that work of getting people out on the vanguard, coming back with things that we might be able to make happen here.
Mr. Lyon, did you want to weigh in on anything?
Sure, I'll jump in real quick. And I'll just let you know also that Dave has joined us. So, you know, we're happy to work with you folks, and we have been working with folks on the parking amendments and, you know, ADUs and all that sort of stuff. You know, our job right now is to, I don't know, enforce is the right word, but we're, you know, Title 21, we interpret it and help push it out as people are trying to do certain things. Whatever you folks want to change, you know, we're happy to work with you and give you our thoughts on, you know, methods to achieving those things. But as soon as you guys figure out the exact priority of which you want to take on first, we're absolutely happy to work with you. We've got an omnibus ordinance out there right now that you should be seeing within the next month or two. And that's just small tweaks, but if they're larger things, then yeah, absolutely. We're gonna work with you to get help you achieve those changes.
Robin, and then Kevin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since I'm new to this process, do we ever bring people in where there have been successes in other communities to inform us how the process worked in their communities and what the scope of work was and the timeline, because I actually happen to know someone who is a pioneer in this in Portland, and I've met someone who also does this work in Pittsburgh, specifically related to tiny homes and ADUs and garage units. And I'm just wondering, how do we coalesce like an informational meeting like that?
Get that clear? You can respond or add it to the list and let us know your thoughts.
Well, I'm writing down the note that to get in touch with you as a possible speaker at a housing summit.
Or maybe your friends. Yeah.
Or
maybe
your friend. Yeah, your friend.
Yeah, your friends.
I think the housing summit could be an opportunity to bring up some experts from different parts of the country if we identify them.
Yeah, hopefully folks who are real forward looking. Anyone else? Okay, Mr. Gates.
Thank you. I was just, as I'm listening to the conversation, wanting to answer that question about ADUs allowed in zoning districts. So I just pulled up the 2022-107 as amended. We did it allowed in all residential and commercial zoning districts. So they're permitted uses, accessory uses.
So
not
I
in
guess
industrial and other
Dean,
districts.
the dilemma might be if it's an accessory dwelling unit, do you need a base dwelling unit on the site? And that might be a question for the planning department. So that might be the limitation. If there is no underlying housing unit, can you have an accessory unit on a commercial property? Maybe that's a Woodfield or Lyons question.
That's a good question. If it's in a commercial district, it's a good
Go
question
ahead,
for
go ahead,
planning.
Mr. Lyons. Dave.
Yeah, this is Dave Whitfield. Mr. Constant, in order for an accessory dwelling unit to be constructed on any property, there first needs to be a principal dwelling unit. So without the principal dwelling unit, you could not construct a accessory dwelling unit.
Okay, so then that's an idea for a project for certain commercial properties to allow an accessory use to be a dwelling unit, an accessory to the commercial use. Mr. Cross.
Yeah, and thank you, Chris. That's exactly right. So there are commercial properties out there that were built in the 70s and 80s that have since been rezoned to R2M, R3, R5 underneath it, but it's still a commercial property, but the land is zoned residential. So that's what I'm looking at. Is there a possibility of allowing a provision to put an ADU on a dental office building that sits on a residential lot, but it's a very big building? Shouldn't they be able to, on the corner, put a small additional dwelling unit?
Right, or above an eye doctor
It's
office.
zoned for it, but unfortunately, under the non-conditional use, they technically can't because it is a
Right.
So that's
So that's a
a
very
small iron out.
interesting. It's not maybe not so small. It sounds like it might be a little complex, but a good one to put on the list for analyzing how we can effectuate dwelling units that are accessory to commercial properties or other non-conforming uses. That's very interesting. I will say that I've spent some time in my neighbors' homes over the last couple of months, and in my neighborhoods, people are very concerned that ADUs, or as they call them, accessory short-term rentals, are going to start cropping up like mushrooms in their neighborhoods. Most often it's people who actually have those already existing who are expressing their concerns, which doesn't generate much sympathy, but it's certainly a hot topic that will need some community conversations around. And so maybe outside of the Housing Summit, which is an expert-driven process with people who are around policy, we also contemplate setting up some kind of a community conversation around housing that's either parallel or synced in time. So we make sure we bring everyone with us. Mr. Volland.
Do we have, I think we discussed this recently, but I know Randy's on the phone. Do we have kind of a timeline for when the short-term rental legislation will be coming before us? Or we're going to have a work session, or it'll be introduced?
Randy, do you want to speak to that?
So I'll apologize. I'm in a really noisy environment. So we are sitting with Dean for initial legal review. I think we're ready for our first work session. I've put together a presentation to describe what we're trying to accomplish. And just to be honest, I think we're probably weeks, months, a month out from getting this out. But to be honest, I think the question is, do we need short-term rental regulation, or do we need something that addresses ADUs in particular? Thank you.
Yeah, and I would say, Mr. Salt, that it might be wise even before you guys have a completed piece at some rules committee or something, you sketch out what the path is you're on so that people can have a snapshot idea of where it's starting. Because if you try to get to a finished product, it might be a little disappointing when it gets to the table and it turns into a robust and explosive conversation, shredded paper flies. And that wouldn't be personal. It just would be, so the sooner people start to socialize to the ideas, maybe the better. Ms. Dern?
The city of Seward just finished this process, so there might be something instructive in what they've done.
City of Seward.
They literally just finished this. So. Well, it's not necessarily ADU, it's on short-term rental, but.
Yep. You got it?
I'm back.
The chair has the floor.
Okay, who's next in the queue? Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, it would be interesting to have a little bit of discussion around explore changing single-family zoning to new residential zoning with broader allowance for building types. Just an example of this, Walla Walla, Washington has changed to RN zoning in some areas, residential neighborhood, where you can have up to, I think, 8 units in an area, and you can have commercial uses that supplement your daily life, like your dry cleaner, your little bodega, your flower shop, your eye doctor, things like that. And I think that this scares a lot of people, but it'd be interesting to have that conversation.
And I see that your name is by this one, Daniel. Have you? And it's fine.
This is not one that we've discussed much, but I guess it's in the exploratory phase. And I think it would potentially provoke a strong response from some in the community. But I think that's what we're really having to grapple with going forward, is that, I will just say, I think the ADU ordinance was an example of this, where we really had a lot of public process, and we heard intentionally from various community councils, and they were able to weigh in, and ultimately we had to make policy that we felt was best for Anchorage. And something that I'm, I guess, becoming more cognizant of is that, how can I say this? Sometimes the voices that we hear from are not the ones who wouldn't have housing, where we are trying to make it easier to create housing. We hear a lot from folks who already have housing in, particularly in some of the lower density neighborhoods. And while I think there's, something to be said for community members and residents having a voice when it comes to the future of our city and the future of their neighborhood, I also think that sometimes we don't hear the voices of those who would potentially be able to live in those parts of our city or those neighborhoods. And I think perhaps what we need to think about is public process on this stuff. So I love the idea of our housing summit. I think that's a great opportunity, but making sure that we're inviting a lot of voices in, and we're not just relying on community council feedback, even though that is very important. And I came up through community council, and but we're at a place in our city where we have a housing shortage. And I think we're going to have to consider all voices, and sometimes, agree and disagree, and make policy that doesn't make everybody happy. So I just want to say that. And I don't know, Craig, if you're prepared to speak on this, but do you have what's at the top of your stack right now, or the planning department stack, when it comes to solving the housing shortage? And are there plans, when we look at zoning in our city, and particularly like along transit corridors, with all of the road rehabilitation that we're seeing in Spenard, and Cook Inlet has their projects that they've done there, and that's an area that's kind of ripe to grow up around public transit. Are there things that we can do where we allow more mixed use, higher density along some of those corridors in ways that would be consistent with like the 2040 land use plan?
I don't know that I have an answer to what's at the top of our stack for how to deal with housing issues. I mean, we're doing a lot of things, but a lot of things are very incremental in how they might assist. What we did with ADUs was certainly towards that bent of trying to help with that. We're certainly here to assist as you guys have this housing summit. We would hope to be very active in that to try to assist, but I don't have anything off the top of my head. Hang on a second, Dave is going to share something.
Yeah, Mr. Boland, this is Dave Whitfield. I think the planning department is understanding of our housing situation, and we've worked with the development community for a long time on these sorts of issues to make more affordable housing. We've done a few different ordinances, the unit lot subdivision, cluster housing developments, obviously two reforms to the ADU regulations. I mean, so we're cognizant of this issue. We're happy to work with the development community. We're happy to work with the assembly to find solutions that provide affordable housing for people. Absolutely.
Yeah. Also, Christine Bonnell is here with our long range planning group. A lot of this stuff has been hitting there, so she wanted to share something.
Yes. Good afternoon. Christine Bonnell here from Long Range Planning. So the downtown code update project and the downtown plan update, both of those were intended to bring thousands of new housing units into downtown. There's new design guidelines, the lot setbacks, the building setbacks are being proposed to be done away with. There's other issues that we had with downtown that we think that we're addressing with the update to the downtown code. And then to get back to the 2040 land use plan, that is a significant plan that directs where properties can be rezoned to allow for more high density housing. And, incrementally as that plan gets implemented and folks come in and do those rezones that are consistent and then sometimes inconsistent with the plan. And so we amend the plan along with that rezone. That's giving developers the ability to go into areas that are maybe not developed right now either. The other thing is the tax incentives that the planning department has helped support wholeheartedly over the past few years. In the downtown plan, we make the recommendation to update those tax incentives and also extend the tax incentives. Right now, the downtown one is going to expire in 2040. And then the deteriorated property zone that's in East Downtown and Fairview is set to expire too in 2040. So
Christine,
the downtown
I think you
plan,
mean 2024, right?
2024, yes,
Yeah.
sorry. So the downtown plan is encouraging those to be renewed so that they can be extended out another 10 years to 2034. So we've got a lot of tools that all of us in the planning department have been working on, and definitely we can help figure out some new ones if there's stuff out there that we can help to do.
Can I ask a follow-up to Christine? So Christine, what you said about the 2040 land use plan potentially teeing up some up zones. I wonder if there's a certain timeline that you have in mind for some of those, because I think that there's appetite on this body to do some of those targeted up zones inconsistent with that, or that would be consistent with that plan.
Sure. So there's a targeted area rezone that's happening right now. It's in the process. And then we've identified another one that is located on Siri property that could occur. And, those are just kind of two examples. And then along the transit-oriented corridors, there's some up zones that could occur along there that are identified in the plan.
So that's in process now. When do you think that would come before us, if you had to guess?
Well, they're not in process. They're sitting there ready to be worked on.
Okay.
They're identified.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
let me know how I can be supportive of that.
Thank you.
Yes, and I think that's all I got. Can I ask maybe Kevin a question? Is that okay? Kevin,
Sure.
you and Meg have a project that you're working on about design standards on conversions to residential. Is that right? Somebody has that project going on, I think. I thought I just saw it in our packet recently. Oh, maybe it's not Kevin. Maybe Shelley knows. Because I think that's a really interesting one too. And I don't think that's on here maybe.
Sure, and then I've got
Yeah, I can address that one. That one actually was born out of the hotel acquisitions. Once you put any kitchen appliance in there, like a microwave even, it changes the use to multifamily. And the residential design standards in 21.07.110 are, to try to achieve those for a hotel that's already constructed would be, astronomically expensive. You've got to have the articulation of the exterior. You've got to have the doors facing forward. You've got to have so many windows, all those things. And so initially we had discussed doing just a Band-Aid to allow some time for them to work through that. But then we decided, let's just rip off the Band-Aid. And so the proposal is to exempt all commercial buildings that are being converted to multifamily from the residential design standards.
And that has been introduced, I think? Or,
Yes.
Okay, great.
Okay, Kevin, Chris, and then Claire.
Actually, I was in the queue and I appreciate it. Daniel asked my question, which was to Craig and Dave, just if they had their own priority list, because they're kind of in the hot seat and they're facing that. And so I understand a lot of their world is just kind of spiraling on the day-to-day tasks, but it would be really, really helpful if from their perspective, when they recognize those issues, they bring us to our attention so we're not, chasing our tails here. Because they've got such a depth of knowledge. But at the same time, I mean, if we created development services and put them in a building and put them far away, and then somehow I feel like that we created this disconnect, because you've got city hall, you got taxis, you got everything over here, but you got development services. So we don't run into the people that are trying to get permits and dealing with frustrations. We just don't see them. They don't stumble in as we're not walking into a lobby. And though that's fantastic for development services, I feel as if that's unintentionally created a disconnect. And so we just don't see people unless they search us out. They don't know where to go. And so I've actually thought about just moving I don't have an Anchorage assembly office. I thought about just setting up in development services and camping out down there with my laptop. I don't know if they might see that as a threat, but it's just so that I can talk to people that don't normally run into us. So after all, why not? That's something I'm passionate about. But yeah, that was just a question I had, was exactly what Daniel had. There's so much, here's the deal. We can make all these code changes. We can do all this, but if the profitability and the cost of construction itself is prohibitive, they're just not going to take action. So the other part of this, how much of this is driven with construction costs, the cost of bringing utilities in, and where do we look at, and what can we do? Listen, you can go completely the far side and say, we don't have any zoning implications, build what you want. But if people can't afford to build it, you're still not going to build. And so at some point we got to approach, at what point, no matter what we do, is there a cost prohibitiveness to certain kinds of development? And so, and what do the supply chain economics look like? I know that bringing utilities into certain lots and stuff is a real challenge. It's extremely cost prohibitive. And looking at how do we get those costs under control? What do the numbers look like, and really analyzing the force. And I don't know how we do that. I don't know how we, as a, I'm against, I'm against taxes. And at the same point, how do you create funds so that we can tie utilities in to create more housing units, because that cost utilities is so expensive. And I don't know what you look at. Where do you come up with the revenue to help subsidize or do that? Or do you just say, hey, it's going to be really expensive? And until we can get those costs down, though, no matter what we do, people aren't going to build because the market's not there. The other side of it is not there. And so it's a complex issue, but I love the challenge.
Chris?
Thanks, Claire. So I think for that, if you look at the table, there isn't a section for subsidies and incentives. And so we might want to add for investigation a whole other category of subsidies and incentives. Recognizing each one has its unique factors of opportunity and cost. Let's not judge them now, but let's contemplate what vehicles are there and maybe even have someone do some research on what subsidy tools are being successful where. So one thing, Mr. Daniel, you talked about community councils is so interesting. Forrest Dunbar used to comment when he sat here a lot that his experience was almost always former leaders of community councils adopt a different posture once they're here. And it's a very common phenomenon and probably for good reason. I won't speak to why. But the other piece, a very specific project I'm bringing back up, and I dropped the ball last year, the East Downtown this year property tax abatement expired on January 1st of this year. So you'll be seeing a package come back very soon as it's done through legal review, just to extend that another 10 years. The sad news is it was only used once. The good news is it was used once, but only recently by the development at the Aviator. And that's the very northwest corner. And we even extended it by half a block because only half that property was in it. And so with 10 years of effort, we managed to move the ball half a block. So that's the tempo sometimes that these changes take. And we have to think in the lifespan of a city. And the lifespan of a city, all of these things will add up if we do them right, but we may not see the fruits of them until such a time as like a symphony, they all start playing together.
Thanks, Chris. I'll go to Randy next, and then maybe we can wrap up with the Housing Summit piece. Randy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Kevin kind of got me thinking, and also going to this STR legislation, why do we do a lot of things that we do? So we want to create more housing, and what would happen if there were no rules? If all rules were removed, you'd have, your U-Haul storage lockers would then have an on-site manager that lives in a building above the office. You might have an optometrist that is downtown and lives above the office. But we tend to prevent a lot of these things through regulation, and I'm not sure why or how we got there. So I guess one of the things as we go into the housing summit maybe is kind of question everything and step back and look at the rules. And if there were no rules, what would the market do? How would we react? How do we spur activity, spur housing at low cost? And if we have rules in place to prevent it, why? Maybe it's a matter of not necessarily new regulation, but removing some of the old regulation. Thank you.
I hear Randy suggesting we should just get rid of Euclidean zoning in Anchorage.
Well, in the Fairview, people have long been advocating for form-based code. And we had a test project for form-based code, and I'm not sure where that went. I bet it just is kind of sitting on some shelf somewhere. But there is an effort and conversation that's been ongoing to experiment outside of the Euclidean grid and get to something that's more modern and beneficial. So if that's not on the list, it should be form-based code and really figure out what has been done and what will. Mr. France, you taking off?
I'm a little confused. Thank you. No, I need to take off. So I am handing the gavel to Chris. And then I guess, Claire, you're next in the queue.
I just wanted to give an update on the housing summit and housing study. That was Those were two items that came out of the priority list last fall. You funded a housing summit in the budget. A housing study did not get funded, but we had several of our community partners come to us and say that they thought that was really critical. So Ms. Roughton and I have been working to try to figure out how to get those in parallel. And
I think planning
yeah,
just got a
a
grant.
box.
Okay,
Yep.
great.
Yep. So the good news is, and well, we didn't want to get too far with the housing summit without seeing how it would tie into a study. But the good news is both planning and ACDA are working on housing studies. So we are all meeting next week to coordinate and make sure they're not duplicating efforts, and to make sure that the things that the assembly and our community partners wanted out of a housing study happen with that. And actually we met with Ms. Roughton, organized some assembly staff and planning team last week, and we had a good discussion on that. Look, Ms. Stern. Oh, I'll keep going. And so housing study seems to be out the door and on the way, and that's great news. We've been working with Mr. Rivera on the housing summit, and I admit last fall I was so gung-ho. We're going to have this great housing summit early in 2023. It's going to be amazing. And then this has been a really busy winter. It just keeps getting pushed off. So I do have a vision for that to be very inclusive. And so hopefully we can pull that off. And I think that might have been paused. So I need to get back in touch with Mr. Rivera to get that up and running again. Hopefully we can do it before summer.
Ms. Stern.
I don't see it listed here specifically, but I expect it might be covered in here. Is there any talk during the Housing Summit to discuss zero carbon, sustainability, microgrid, some really interesting innovations that might actually sort of forego a lot of conventional utility wisdom? There's a lot going on out there, and I'm just wondering if that's at all in the process of being discussed.
I don't think so. So I'm adding it to the list. That's a great idea.
All right, thank you. So, yeah, there's a lot here. Anyone else?
I would just say this is really exciting, and I'm stoked to keep the conversation going.
So we have time and some people in the audience. Is there anyone who's here that wants to have 3 minutes to pitch their thoughts on a housing summit or conversation relating to housing? It's not a normal process that we would do that in a work session, but we're discussing the possibility of a summit that's broad in the community. And so this seems germane. Anyone? Come on up. There's a microphone. Please state your name for the record. We'll give you 3 minutes. Any of those mics is fine.
Hi, my name is Duncan Fisher. I live in Anchorage and I would like to stay living here, but as you all know, property values are very high. We haven't built a whole lot of housing in the last 20 or so years in Anchorage. It's all the property development's been going to the valley. First of all, we need a general upzone. I think that's pretty accepted. We have pretty restrictive zoning in the bulk of the city. South Addition is R2M or R2A, which is pretty much built out. You're not going to get much more multifamily in there until we make it easier to build multifamily. But the biggest thing I think Anchorage needs to look at, and I've talked to Chris a little bit and Daniel about this, is there's a building form change that Washington, it just passed the Washington State Senate to allow single stair buildings, which is not gonna be able to get into totally what it is in 3 minutes. But the big thing is there are fire codes that we have in the US that are arbitrary or semi-arbitrary for how you build a building, and what that ends up in the context of development is buildings that are very thick with a corridor with rooms on each side, like a hotel. And if we were to take a comprehensive look at our fire code, our building code, and look at other places, look at all of Europe, why does North American building form stand out and is so different? Is this lack of a proper approach to a second egress? So probably going to bug you guys a little bit more about it in the near future, but I think if Anchorage could look into allowing second egress paths that aren't just a second staircase in their code, it would be really big for what does pencil out for developers and what is available, what is even can be built within our existing land use. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Nope. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Anyone last time want to get in the queue? I think, as again, a principle of Mr. Dunbar, that our deadline is a ceiling, not a target, and it is late in the week. If there's no other business, I would adjourn us and we can get on to the weekend. Anyone else? Okay, we're adjourned. Have a good weekend.